Let's talk about Alexei Navalny. So Alexei Navalny is dead. Alexei Navalny, a few years ago, was arrested by the Russian government back in 2021 once he had come back to Russia on a plane. He was coming back from Russia because he was poisoned just shortly before that, and then he was treated by doctors who determined that he had been poisoned. And that the poisoning likely happened in his tea, that he was drinking tea and that his tea was poisoned in a way that is eerily reminiscent of how many other Putin critics had been poisoned and killed both abroad and within the Russian Federation. So he fled to Germany, he got medical treatment, he got better, then he came back to Russia, got arrested, and got put back in prison. And once he was in prison, he still released every once in a while some political statements, but his general, figure or his general image kind of stayed out of the limelight because he was in containment for 3 years. And while he was able to release political statements, there was not much more he could do while he was under the direct control of the Russian government. Now, who is Alexei Navalny? Why did the Russians go out of their way to arrest this guy just right when he landed on their soil? Well, Alexei Navalny is an interesting cat. He's certainly a political animal. He was much earlier on in politics when I was probably still a baby. He was known for some pretty provocative statements about minority groups in Russia, and he would participate in rallies that he was frequented by white nationalists, Russian supremacists, just straight up Nazis, to be blunt. And he was somebody you would call like a through and through Russian nationalist, and he leaned into that. And if you look at a lot of his writings or political workings at the time, they're pretty imperial in nature, and a lot of those imperial themes, as he would go on into the future of his politics, he would still adapt them even in a more milquetoast way as he became like the Western darling. Now, that doesn't mean that he hasn't done anything useful. I'm just putting in perspective that Alexei Navalny is not this like perfect Western like libcuck like hero yahoo, that he is a political animal, and when the opposition to Putin got smashed in all other ways, he was kind of like almost the last man standing. Not to say that he was the first one to oppose Putin or that he was the last one to oppose Putin, but that he was able to keep his profile above water longest while not being killed by Vladimir Putin. And he was able to keep his image particularly salient around young people by releasing YouTube videos with his anti-corruption bureau before it was shut down by the Russian government, where he would expose corruption within Russia. One of the most famous examples of this, which you got to give him credit for because it was really good reporting. I have two. No, not this guy. Alexei Navalny Mansion is when he did a documentary showing Vladimir Putin's mansion and the extravagant wealth that he had, exposing it and alleging that he was able to make this gigantic wealth, these gigantic mansions with their pristine toilets and gold everything, that he did it off the public dollar, that he did it off the back of everyday Russians. Now, of course, Vladimir Putin isn't the only one that's horribly corrupt or the only one that is exposed in the corruption documentary. As we've talked about before, Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is also extremely notoriously corrupt. Medvedev's corrupt. Everybody you can tell that's high-level Russian politics is corrupt, some more than others. And Navalny was exposing that, and that was something that got him a lot of support amongst young Russians and amongst the Russian opposition, was his ability to call out that type of rampant corruption and bring attention to it and get a lot of views doing it. Because while other people had called Putin corrupt before, it wasn't like Navalny had invented the idea of Putin being corrupt. He did get a lot of attention to it, and he was able to yell it louder than others. Now, Navalny ultimately, I think, was arrested back in 2021 because they probably had already decided months before that he was done, that the regime was done with him. They had already shut down his anti-corruption bureau. They had already poisoned him, almost certainly. I'm guessing here because we don't know for sure that it was the Russian government that poisoned him, but I mean, you know, it definitely had all the signs of it. And so I think they had already decided when he came back that they were kind of done with him. And so when they sent him off to that Siberian prison in the middle of nowhere, it was pretty concerning concerning because we knew that him going off to the Siberian prison a few years into his prison stint meant that it would be harder to communicate with him, that it'd be harder to keep an eye on Navalny, and we didn't know what his condition would advance into. Sadly, it seems like the Russian government is saying that he fell over and just kind of died. They're not saying they know exactly how. Putin's press secretary Peskov was like, you got to wait for the doctors. But obviously, everybody is suspecting that there was some foul play. Now, I'm not saying that we know for 100% sure that the Russian government directly murdered him. It could be that they just created all of the worst conditions. Because you can see Navalny got skinnier and skinnier and skinnier during his time in detainment. Do we have any pictures of it? Not Navy. Navalny. Skinny. Yeah, like this. These are some of the last images. Like he's a shell of his former self. He's like, oh my God. It's kind of hard to see it, but you can see that the structure in his bone, whatever. Point is, it's hard to see it, but he's not the only one in Russian prison whose health deteriorated over time. But it could be that his health deteriorated over time. They kept him in poor conditions, and then the poor conditions that they kept him in eventually took its course. Whatever it is exactly, we don't know all of the specifics. Okay, what's like reportedly the last photo of Alexei alive. Okay, 1 second. Let me pause stream for a second. I'll check it out. So here is the last picture of Navalny alive. Man, is that really the last picture? My goodness. Smiling and everything, huh? My God. Well, you could say a lot of things about Navalny, but the dude was not a coward. I think you could at least say that. My goodness. Anyway, Navalny is dead. Exactly how he died, we don't know. The odds of it being connected to the Russian government are, I mean, in my opinion, all but certain, even if it was just creating the conditions that led to his death. Now, what does Navalny's death mean? Well, it's kind of complicated to say exactly what it immediately means because we don't know what the American government's going to do in response. What I can show you guys is a few responses to it, and then I'll tell you what I think it means. So first off, there are some protests in Russia, not much. They're very small, and anybody going out to any of the locations where they're going to like honor his life or lay down a few flowers to be like they're sad that Navalny dead, the Russian cops are immediately being sent out and cracking down on the protesters, arresting them, making sure they don't gather in groups because the regime is very scared of spiraling out protests and probably still has trauma from Euromaidan.
In the aftermath of the death of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Earlier we heard from our International Affairs Editor Dominic Waghorn, his analysis of how the government in Russia clamps down on all forms of opposition. We have just had these pictures in, I believe, showing two Rus News journalists, it's a local news provider in Russia, being detained by authorities. Of course, people had been told by the authorities in Russia not to come out in numbers, not to protest following the death of Mr. Navalny. These
interesting thing. They would never really mention Navalny's name in the Russian media. They would also they would always refer to him like as a blogger or something. They'd always keep it very vague. The only time I've ever seen them do it was when he died. That was the one time that the Russian TV like interrupted the news broadcast, interrupted everything. Said Navalny's dead. And that was that. Just something to think about.
Pictures, we believe, show two journalists, Yulia Petrova, being detained in Moscow. There are also pictures, we believe, I'm not sure that these are those, but there are other pictures showing the moments before the detention of another Rus News journalist, Alina Kozyshin, in St. Petersburg. So clearly there is something of a protest taking place across Russia, something of a clamp.
So there's a few protests. They're scattered. They're not, to be quite blunt, extremely significant. This will probably be the extent of dissent in Russia. The majority of it will probably be online, not on the streets, as people are scared of being arrested and rumors circulating of you being arrested and then sent to the front line. I don't think anybody wants that to happen to them. So as for the idea that there'll maybe be some big backlash from Russian civil society, my response would be Russian civil society does no longer exist. So I don't know if there's really much of a backlash to happen in the first place, or much fertile ground for a backlash. Tucker Carlson couldn't have said this at a worse time. Check this out.
I'll use the devil's advocate.
But advocate away.
Yes, okay, I'll tell you. You should challenge in the rules of an interview, and you're a master in your...
Now, to be clear, they're talking about Tucker's interview with Vladimir Putin, and he's going to bring up, why didn't you bring up Navalny? And check out his response to this, which has become eerie considering what just happened.
In your business. It's not for me to give you a lecture about that, but you should challenge some ideas. For instance, you didn't talk about freedom of speech in Russia. You did not talk about Navalny, about assassinations, about the restrictions on opposition in the coming elections.
I didn't talk about the things that every other American media outlet talks about.
Why?
Exclusively,
Yes, this
because
is my
those are
question.
covered, and because I have spent my life talking to people who run countries in various countries and have concluded the following.
The problem is, for me, is it's not just that they were covered, though. These things can be covered, but then the questions could not be posed to the government officials because the government officials controls their environment to make sure that these questions are not answered. For example, if somebody like never asked Joe Biden about him being old, but always covered in the media him being old, there's still a usefulness in asking him to respond. If anything, I think there would be more of a usefulness in asking him to respond to it because it seems to be a topic on the public consciousness, something that people want an answer to. And so if anything, having all these public knowledge on Navalny, if he was to ask in that interview about Alexei Navalny, if he was to try to bring more attention to it, maybe this moment where he dies would ring differently, or maybe there would have been more attention dragged to Navalny on the eve of his death. And I mean, I don't want to openly speculate, but we could see, obviously now in hindsight, the potential usefulness in bringing up Navalny in an interview like this, even if I am not a huge Navalny fan for reasons I've already mentioned.
That every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people. Sorry.
That message aged so poorly. Less than 24 hours later, Navalny's dead, and his comment on Navalny dying or being imprisoned amounts to, I mean, death is death. Leaders kill. That there's no differentiation between what just happened with Alexei Navalny and, say, you know, Biden ordering some drone strike. There's no difference between, like, it's all just morally gray. It's all different shades of gray. There's no difference here, no difference there between killing a political opponent or killing this or killing this. Just, it's all gray, all morally gray. What brilliant analysis from Mr. Tucker.
That's why I wouldn't want to be a leader. That press restriction is universal in the United States. I know because I've lived it. Ask my former, I've had a lot of jobs. And I've done this for 34 years, and I know how it works. And there's more censorship in Russia than there is in the United States, but there's a great deal in the United States. And so, at a certain point, it's like people can decide.
For me, this is like the whining Westerner. This is the whiny, privileged Westerner not realizing the advantages he has. If Tucker Carlson talked the way about Vladimir Putin the way he talks about Joe Biden, he'd be thrown off a building, or he'd have the same fate as Alexei Navalny. To try to pretend that these things are all like just a little morally vague or all the same, or there's not really that much of a difference, and all leaders kill at the end of the day, it just makes everything morally ambiguous. And there's no difference between the horrific lack of civil society that exists in Russia and the slander laws that exist in the United States. The American government messaging Twitter and asking them to take down pictures of Hunter's penis. The majority of the requests they didn't abide by. Like, we're supposed to pretend these two things are the same. It's honestly pathetic.
Whether they think, what countries they think are better, what systems they think are better. I just want to know what he thinks. That was the whole point.
Moving on. Fox News had some very brilliant commentary on Alexei Navalny's death. Check this out.
I think you could even venture to wonder if Alexei Navalny would have been treated how he was if there was a different president in office today.
All I know.
Is it Biden's fault? Is it Biden's fault, guys? It might be Biden's fault, guys. Maybe it's Biden's fault. Now, the thing that interested me about this is Joe Biden probably released a statement more in support of Alexei Navalny than either of his predecessors did, either Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Barack Obama. Here's the statement that Joe Biden released in 2021 when Alexei Navalny was first arrested once re-entering Russia after being treated for being poisoned.
What did you say would happen if opposition leader Alexei Navalny dies?
I made it clear to him that I believe the consequences of that would be devastating for Russia. I'll go back to the same point. What do you think happens when he's saying it's not about hurting Navalny, all the stuff he says to rationalize the treatment of Navalny, and then he dies in prison?
Devastating consequences. I don't know how these words or this type of messaging at all leads to Navalny dying, and if there was someone else in Joe Biden's position, Navalny might still be alive. I think this is just, just finding anything you desperately can to throw at Joe Biden here. But I will say about this statement, because this statement is throwing me for a loop, because I've realized that this statement has lost a lot of weight. See, this statement was originally given in 2021 before the Russians invaded in Ukraine. And when you think about how much the situation has escalated since then, how much leverage we don't have anymore because we've already put our different cards in play, I think part of the reason why Alexei Navalny is dead, outside of, I think, the basic revenge element, I think some people are undercutting the fact that Navalny did humiliate Putin with his documentaries. Navalny did directly challenge Putin. And Putin now has not only dealt with challenges from Alexei Navalny, but Prigozhin, from other sources. So I think a certain element of this is revenge. But with the Americans already sending weapons to the Ukrainians, with the Americans already sanctioning a ton of Russian companies, sanctioning tons of Russian oligarchs, sanctioning tons of Russian government officials, with the American government already engaging in a price cap, with the American government already engaged in intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians, with Western allies as well outside of the United States also engaging in support, I think Vladimir Putin may have come to the conclusion that, well, we've already got all the cards on the table. All the cards you would have played in response to me, like sanctions, in the event of Navalny's death, are already in play. Might as well kill Navalny or let him die. I mean, I don't want to tell you that I know Putin's thinking, and I know that's exactly the reason why Navalny is dead today, but just something to consider. Because here's my question then to you guys. What does Biden do in response to Navalny's death? What do we do in response? In other circumstances, it would probably be some sanctions, both on maybe Russia and Russian government officials, maybe some oligarchs. That's what I would assume. But I think most of those sanctions are already been in place. Most of the stuff we have to do with sanctions is adjusting our sanctions to try to deal with the loopholes that the Russian government is trying to find other ways to stop American, not American intelligence companies, but American tech companies from having its chips and other components ending up in Russian weapons. So I don't really know what other leverage he could have outside of, in my mind, doubling down in support for Ukraine. That's the only other, I think that's the one pressure valve that I think has the most ability to twist and turn, but that is being crippled by decision atrophy, in part implemented by the MAGA movement and Mike Johnson by holding up a vote on Ukraine aid. So even that lever is a little bit rusted at the very least. He can still use, different tools. Forbes released a really good article recently talking about how Joe Biden could use other terms like the excess, use other mechanisms like the excess defense articles, not clause, but by using excess defense articles in order to support Ukraine. But I think a lot of that leverage that we used to have that would make at least the Russians think twice before taking out their opposition like this, I think it's gone. And so what does this mean? I think a lot of this, I mean, for the Russian opposition, I'll have to leave that to Russian opposition figures to figure that out. I don't know how much weight Alexei Navalny still had after 3 years of detainment. I don't know how much he has been involved from behind a prison cell or after he's moved to Siberia. Effectively now he is seen as a martyr. But I can tell you definitely how Westerners will view it, because this happened during the Munich Security Conference. Did you guys know that? The Munich Security Conference is going on right now, and you know who's at the Munich Security Conference? Alexei Navalny's wife, along with multiple other Western leaders, European leaders, American leaders, etc. So his wife is at the Munich Security Conference, surrounded by different Western leaders, all of which are terribly sympathetic to Alexei Navalny, surrounded by other intellectuals who are also terribly sympathetic to Alexei Navalny. I've heard that she's also given a speech there, so I'm sure that will have some weight as well. And so I think from our perspective, not talking about the Russian opposition, which I will leave to others to discuss, I think that a lot of this is going to be viewed, or a lot of people from the West are going to view this almost as if they've closed the door on civil society. Now, I think that that has already been done a while ago, but for many people, Navalny kind of was an image of a Russia that could be, was a potential starting point for an alternative path. He was hope for a lot of young Russians. He was hope for a lot of other people who thought Russia maybe could westernize and liberalize and act like, I don't know, Germany, Sweden, or one of these other countries. And for a lot of people, I assume it's like that hope has just been crushed. That alternative to Vladimir Putin has been eliminated. And I think that's a big thing that reinforces Putin's strength. Is if you were to have a bunch of different food options, and there were some that were somewhat good, some that were somewhat bad, some that were great, some that were awful, you know, you'd have a lot of selection. And so if you were used to like 20 years of the same meal, you might look at all these other options and be like, oh, actually, that looks a little better. But if you deny every other option, if there's no other options outside of Putin, 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 and you're not given an alternative, then it's kind of hard for you to imagine or strive for an alternative that you do not have. It's hard for Russians to rally around a separate cause or a separate future if that future isn't being, you know, outlined for them, isn't being described by someone, isn't being sought by some political leader. So I think for a lot of people, at least in the West, they're going to see the death of Alexei Navalny as the death of the alternative and the entrenchment of the Russian establishment in Moscow. Now, I mean, this is something that I think has already happened a long time ago, but I do think that this might have the potentiality of being kind of a final funeral bell of that alternative, and maybe waking a few people up to the current state and reality of Moscow politics. Anyway, what else do we have? Oh, I do also want to show you guys somebody's response that I wish that just kept their mouth shut. This is from Speaker Mike Johnson in response to Navalny's death. Vladimir Putin is a vicious dictator, and the world knows he is likely directly responsible for the sudden death of his most prominent political opponent, Alexei Navalny. Putin has shown his willingness to use extreme measures, including the use of radioactive material, to attack his enemies and expand his power. If confirmed, his action is emblematic of Putin's global pattern of silencing critics and eliminating opponents out of fear of dissent. This is the latest attempt to send a message to those working to confront Moscow's aggression. In the coming days, as international leaders are meeting in Munich, we must be clear that Putin will be met with united opposition. As Congress debates the best path forward to support Ukraine, the United States and our partners must be using every means available to cut off Putin's ability to fund his unprovoked war in Ukraine and aggression against the Baltic states. What a crock of shit. What a crock of shit. Out of all the people to open their fat mouth, out of all the people, this guy, really? Come on, you've been blocking up aid to Ukraine since what, October? Since October of last year, over 100-something days, you've been blocking the aid. What do you think is emboldening him? It is the idea that America can do nothing. Why does he think America can do nothing? Because of him. Come on.